Oil has always been more than fuel. It is leverage, it is power, and sometimes it is a fuse. Right now, the Trump administration is playing a dangerous game with Venezuela's oil, demanding that a sovereign nation cut all economic ties with China and Russia as the price for pumping its own crude. Republicans call it strength, Democrats call it reckless. One senator used a simpler word: boneheaded. This isn't just about barrels and pipelines. It's about whether the United States believes the world is a chessboard or a minefield. Because when you tell Venezuela to choose between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, you're not just making a trade demand, you're forcing a geopolitical ultimatum. And history tells us something uncomfortable. Ultimatums rarely end quietly. If you want deeper, clearer analysis of how power really works beyond slogans and sound bites, stay with me. Because before we argue whether this strategy is smart or insane, we need to understand what problem the Trump administration is actually trying to solve and why Venezuela sits at the center of it. The core question here is not whether the United States should push back against China and Russia. Even many Democrats agree on that. The real question is how power is exercised and at what cost. The Trump administration's position is blunt. Venezuela can pump more oil only if it meets two conditions: cut economic ties with countries adversarial to the US and sell oil exclusively in partnership with Washington. Supporters see clarity. Critics see coercion. Democrats aren't warning about weakness. They're warning about escalation, about turning a regional energy issue into a direct test of wills with Beijing and Moscow, about treating Venezuelan oil not as a national resource, but as a bargaining chip owned by someone else. There is also a moral fault line. Several lawmakers argue that oil belongs to the Venezuelan people, meant for development, not as tribute in a geopolitical standoff. Others worry this approach could make it harder, not easier, to build a legitimate government in Caracas. To understand why this dispute is so volatile, we have to step back into history, influence, and how Venezuela became entangled in great power rivalry in the first place. Venezuela did not become a geopolitical battleground overnight. It was pulled there slowly, predictably, by vacuum and opportunity. Years of internal instability weakened the country's institutions. As legitimacy eroded, space opened. And into that space stepped external powers willing to trade money, investment, and political backing for influence. China and Russia didn't arrive with tanks. They arrived with financing, partnerships, and economic ties. From Washington's perspective, this was not just about Venezuela. It was about precedent, about adversaries gaining a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, about oil, minerals, and strategic depth. The fear was not ideological, it was structural. But influence doesn't work like a switch you flip on and off. It works through dependence, history, and incentives built over time. When economic ties form, they create gravity. Pulling a country out of that orbit is not simple, and forcing it can trigger backlash. That's the cycle we've seen before. Pressure creates resistance. Resistance invites escalation. And once escalation begins, it rarely stays contained. Which brings us to the first real breaking point where strategy meets reality and theory collides with consequence. The first crack appears when pressure stops being abstract and starts demanding a response. Requiring Venezuela to sever economic ties with China and Russia is not a symbolic gesture. It is a direct challenge. Democrats warn that Beijing and Moscow will not simply watch their influence evaporate. They will answer. The question is how and where. Some lawmakers describe the policy as needlessly provocative, not because confrontation is wrong, but because this confrontation is poorly timed and poorly structured. For very little immediate gain, it risks igniting friction with two global powers simultaneously. There is also the tone. The openness with which President Trump has spoken about taking Venezuela's oil has unsettled critics. To them, it crosses a line from pressure to possession, from diplomacy to domination. And once that perception takes hold, it reshapes every negotiation that follows. Even those who support rejecting adversary influence admit discomfort with the framing. Oil, they argue, belongs to the Venezuelan people, not to a foreign leader's leverage strategy. This is where the crisis sharpens, because when a policy feels illegitimate, it doesn't just face resistance abroad, it fractures consensus at home. And beneath that fracture lies a deeper question. What is this strategy really built on? What's driving this strategy is a simple idea with a complicated reality. The administration is treating the world as a zero-sum game. If China and Russia lose influence, the United States wins. Pressure replaces persuasion, leverage replaces legitimacy. The Monroe Doctrine logic is back. This is our hemisphere. Republicans defending the policy see strength. They argue that adversaries have used Venezuela to prop up their global ambitions, especially through oil and minerals. From that lens, forcing a clean break is not aggression, it's reclamation. But Democrats warn about the hidden mechanism beneath that logic. Influence is not owned, it is negotiated. And when you try to erase it overnight, you don't create a vacuum, you create resistance. China and Russia are not passive actors. They have interests, investments, and pride at stake. There's another mechanism at work: sovereignty. When demands appear to override a nation's control over its own resources, legitimacy collapses, not just internationally, but inside Venezuela itself. That makes cooperation harder, not easier. This is the paradox. A strategy designed to weaken rivals may instead harden them. And as pressure intensifies, systems respond. Which leads us to the second surge of tension: faster, sharper, and far less predictable. The second surge comes not from intention, but from reaction. Democrats warn that once China and Russia feel cornered, responses won't be linear, they won't necessarily show up in Venezuela itself, they could appear elsewhere. Through economic retaliation, diplomatic obstruction, strategic signaling that reminds Washington this is not a one-sided game. This is why some lawmakers call the approach dangerously underdeveloped. They argue the administration is escalating without a clear end state. Pressuring Venezuela is one thing. Managing the ripple effects across global power centers is another. Even supporters quietly admit uncertainty. What does it actually mean to run Venezuela's oil? Who enforces compliance? And what happens if Caracas resists or complies publicly while hedging privately? At this stage, ambiguity becomes combustible. Allies don't know where they stand. Adversaries test boundaries, and miscalculation becomes more likely with every move. This is the moment where foreign policy stops being theory and starts being lived experience, where decisions made in briefing rooms land on ordinary people. Because when great powers collide, it's never elites who absorb the shock first. It's the citizens caught in between. For the Venezuelan people, this isn't a chess match. It's survival. When oil becomes leverage between great powers, you don't feel strategy, you feel consequences. You feel uncertainty about jobs, prices, and whether today's decision will make tomorrow harder. Lawmakers warn that treating Venezuela's oil as someone else's bargaining chip risks punishing the very people who are supposed to benefit from change. Some Democrats stress this point repeatedly. Oil belongs to the Venezuelan people. It should fuel development, stability, and legitimacy, not serve as collateral in a standoff between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. When foreign pressure overrides that principle, trust erodes inside the country and beyond it. There's also fear of backlash. If China and Russia respond, it won't be abstract. It could mean tighter economic conditions, fewer options, less room to breathe. And for ordinary citizens, fewer choices always hurt the most. If you're watching this and thinking, this feels distant, it isn't. Because these are the moments when policy decides who bears the cost of power. If you want analysis that centers people, not just politics, stay with me. Because what happens next won't stop at Venezuela's borders. What starts in Venezuela does not stay in Venezuela. Democrats repeatedly warn that this strategy risks triggering a wider chain reaction. China and Russia are not just economic partners to Caracas, they are global actors. If pushed out of one arena, they look for leverage in another. That's how localized pressure turns into systemic tension. This is where geopolitics becomes interconnected. An energy decision in Latin America echoes through diplomatic corridors, military calculations, and trade negotiations far beyond the Western Hemisphere. Lawmakers fear a world where every region becomes a zero-sum contest, where cooperation collapses into permanent rivalry. One senior Democrat put it plainly: if every interaction becomes we win or they win, the likelihood of deeper conflict rises everywhere. Not necessarily war, but constant friction, constant retaliation, constant instability. Supporters of the policy argue this is the price of leadership. That US dominance is preferable to Chinese or Russian influence. Critics don't dispute the competition, they dispute the method. Because global power isn't just asserted, it's sustained, and how the United States handles Venezuela may signal to the world whether it still believes in balance or only in force. That signal will shape what comes next. Looking ahead, three paths emerge, each shaped by the same decision, but unfolding very differently. The first is the optimistic scenario. Pressure works, Venezuela aligns more closely with the United States, China and Russia lose influence without major retaliation, oil revenues are redirected toward rebuilding legitimacy, and tensions stabilize. This is the outcome. Supporters envision a clean assertion of power with minimal fallout. The second is the messier reality. Venezuela complies partially, hedges quietly, and China and Russia respond indirectly. Diplomatic friction rises, trust erodes. The US gains leverage, but at the cost of constant management and growing uncertainty. No explosion, just persistent instability. The third is the dangerous path. Ultimatums harden positions. Retaliation spreads beyond Venezuela. Economic pressure intensifies. And the world slides further into bloc politics, where every resource becomes a weapon and every region a front line. None of these futures are predetermined. They depend on restraint, clarity, and whether power is exercised with foresight or impulse, because systems remember how they are treated. And the way this moment is handled will echo far beyond oil, far beyond Venezuela, into how the next confrontation is judged before it even begins.